John Harris was a seasoned journalist who had seen his fair share of strange stories in the small town of Oak Ridge. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, Oak Ridge was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and where nothing much ever happened until the disappearances began. It started with subtlety, the kind of news that didn't make the front page. A young woman named Sarah Mitchell, who worked at the local diner, vanished one evening after her shift. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken windows, no blood. Her car was still parked outside, keys in the ignition, but Sarah was gone as if she had evaporated into thin air. The town whispered about her fate, but the police had little to go on. She became just another name on the growing list of the missing. John took a particular interest in these disappearances when Emily Parker, a close friend and fellow journalist at the Oak Ridge Gazette, didn't show up for work one morning. She had been working late on an investigative piece about a series of old, unsolved cases in the town's archives, cases that bore an eerie resemblance to the current string of vanishings. When John called her phone, it went straight to voicemail. Panic set in when he drove by her apartment only to find the door ajar and her belongings scattered, as if she had been in a hurry to leave, or as if someone had taken her. The police, led by the weary and skeptical Sheriff Tom Miller, treated Emily's disappearance like the others, with a resigned acceptance that people just vanished in Oak Ridge. But John couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was at play. He had seen Emily just the day before, and she had mentioned something strange, a pattern she had discovered in the old files. She had planned to share her findings with him the next day, but that day never came. Determined to uncover the truth, John began to piece together the puzzle Emily had started. He combed through her notes, and what he found chilled him to the bone. Each of the missing persons had disappeared under similar circumstances, and each had been last seen near the outskirts of town, close to an old, overgrown path that led to a place few dared to visit, the abandoned Oak Ridge Cemetery. This cemetery had been closed for decades, its iron gates rusted shut, the gravestones crumbling under the weight of time. The locals believed it was cursed, a place where the restless dead waited for unwary souls to stumble into their grasp. But John wasn't one for superstitions. He was a man of facts, and he knew there had to be a rational explanation. Still, as he prepared to visit the cemetery, a gnawing sense of dread began to take hold. The first disappearance was just the beginning, and John Harris was about to uncover a secret that had been buried for far too long. John Harris couldn't shake the unease that settled over him as he approached the outskirts of Oak Ridge. The road leading to the abandoned cemetery was more of a narrow, forgotten trail, overgrown with weeds and flanked by towering, ancient trees whose branches intertwined like skeletal fingers blocking out the sun. The air grew colder as he ventured deeper into the woods, the chill biting through his jacket and seeping into his bones. It was as if the forest itself was warning him to turn back. But John was determined. He had spent the previous night going over Emily Parker's notes, tracing the last known movements of the missing people, and every lead pointed to this forsaken place. The cemetery had once been the town's main burial ground, a somber resting place for generations of Oak Ridge's dead. However, after a series of tragic events, stories of graves being desecrated and whispers of strange rituals performed under the cover of darkness, the town council had decided to close it down. A new cemetery was established closer to the town center, and the old one was left to rot, forgotten by most. When John finally reached the cemetery's entrance, he paused. The iron gates stood tall, their blackened metal twisted and rusted with age. They creaked ominously as he pushed them open, the sound reverberating through the quiet woods like a mournful cry. The path beyond was barely visible, the stones cracked and crumbling under the weight of decades of neglect. Dead leaves and debris carpeted the ground, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. As he ventured further inside, John noticed the gravestones. Most were worn down by time, the inscriptions almost illegible. Yet, as he walked deeper into the cemetery, something odd began to catch his eye. Among the ancient, weathered stones were several that appeared disturbingly new. The soil around them was fresh, the grass not yet regrown. No names were carved into these stones, no dates, no epitaphs. They were blank, as if the person buried there had never existed. John's heart pounded in his chest as he knelt beside one of the fresh graves, his fingers brushing over the cold, smooth surface of the headstone. The earth here was soft, recently disturbed, and it sent a shiver down his spine. He counted at least 6 of these unmarked graves, all scattered in a haphazard manner as if they had been dug in a rush, with no regard for the sanctity of the dead. The eerie silence of the cemetery was only broken by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But John couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the eyes of the dead were upon him, their hollow sockets following his every move. He looked around, his senses on high alert, but there was no one, just the oppressive stillness of the forgotten graveyard. As he explored further, John came across an old, dilapidated mausoleum in the far corner of the cemetery. Its stone door was slightly ajar, and dark ivy crawled over its surface like black veins. With his heart hammering in his chest, he pushed the door open, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was thick and stale, reeking of mold and death. Dust motes floated through the thin beam of light that filtered in from the outside. The mausoleum was small, barely large enough to hold a single coffin. But what caught John's attention was a series of strange symbols carved into the walls, symbols he had seen before in Emily's notes. They were ancient, their meaning lost to time, but they carried an undeniable sense of dread. It was as if the very walls were trying to speak to him, to warn him of something far more sinister than he could comprehend. In the center of the mausoleum lay an open coffin, its lid leaning against the wall. Inside, John expected to find bones, the remnants of someone long dead. But instead, the coffin was empty, save for a thick layer of dust and the faint outline of where a body should have been. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This was no ordinary cemetery. Something, or someone, was removing the bodies. As he backed out of the mausoleum, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He could feel the weight of the place pressing down on him, the whispers of the dead growing louder in his mind. He turned and hurried back down the path toward the gates, the cemetery's malevolent presence almost palpable. The fresh graves, the empty coffin, the ancient symbols, they all pointed to something dark and unnatural at work. John knew he was onto something that Emily had also discovered before she vanished. As he reached the gates and the safety of the open woods, he cast one last glance back at the cemetery. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, as if beckoning him to return, to uncover more of the secrets buried within. But John was no fool. He would need more than curiosity to face whatever lurked in that cursed place. As he made his way back to town, his mind raced with questions, and a cold knot of fear settled in his stomach. The cemetery of the disappeared was far from abandoned. It was very much alive, and John feared that the horrors he had uncovered were just the beginning. The events of the previous day haunted John Harris as he sat at his kitchen table, the morning sunlight doing little to chase away the shadows lingering in his mind. He couldn't forget the sensation of being watched in the cemetery, nor the sight of those freshly dug, nameless graves. Something was very wrong in Oak Ridge, and the closer he got to the truth, the more he felt that his life was in danger. Determined to get answers, John decided to return to the cemetery that night. But this time, he would come prepared. He packed a bag with a flashlight, a small spade, and his camera. If he was going to find anything, he needed proof. Evidence that could convince the authorities, or at the very least, provide answers to the families of the missing. The day dragged on, each hour seeming to stretch into eternity as he waited for nightfall. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting the town in shades of purple and black, John set out toward the cemetery once more. The streets of Oak Ridge were eerily quiet, the usual hum of life replaced by an unsettling stillness. It was as if the town itself knew something was wrong, and everyone was too afraid to acknowledge it. The trail leading to the cemetery was even more foreboding in the dark. The trees, their twisted branches clawing at the sky, seemed to close in around him as he walked. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snap of a twig, sent jolts of adrenaline through his veins. But John pressed on, driven by a need to understand what was happening. When he reached the cemetery gates, he paused, taking a deep breath to steady his nerves. The iron gates loomed before him, now bathed in the cold light of the moon. The cemetery beyond was a landscape of shadows, the gravestones jutting out like jagged teeth. John pushed the gates open, the creaking metal echoing through the stillness. As he stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and a low mist clung to the ground, swirling around his feet. John turned on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, revealing the rows of graves that had been lost to time. But it was the newer graves he was interested in, the ones he had found the day before, with their fresh earth and blank headstones. He approached one of the graves, the beam of his flashlight shaking slightly as he knelt down and began to dig. The soil was soft, turning easily under his spade, and with each shovelful, the knot of fear in his stomach tightened. What would he find? Another empty coffin? Or something far worse? After several minutes of digging, the spade hit something solid. John's heart pounded in his ears as he cleared away the remaining dirt, revealing the top of a wooden coffin. The wood was new, unweathered by time. With trembling hands, he pried open the lid, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the coffin was empty. The sight sent a wave of cold dread crashing over him. Just like the coffin in the mausoleum, there was no body, no remains, nothing but an empty shell. But as John shone his flashlight deeper into the coffin, he noticed something peculiar. Scratch marks along the inside, as if someone, or something, had tried to claw their way out. His mind reeled at the implication. Whoever, or whatever, had been placed in this coffin hadn't been dead. The thought was almost too horrifying to process, but the evidence was right in front of him. He couldn't deny it. Suddenly, a low, guttural sound echoed through the cemetery, sending a jolt of terror through John. He whipped around, his flashlight beam dancing erratically across the gravestones. The sound came again, closer this time, a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to resonate in the very ground beneath him. John's breath quickened, his pulse pounding in his throat. He stood frozen, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The growl grew louder, and with it came the sound of shuffling footsteps dragging across the earth. Something was out there, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. Finally, his survival instincts kicked in. John dropped the spade and turned to flee, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he sprinted back toward the gates. The footsteps followed, gaining on him, the growl turning into a guttural roar that seemed to vibrate through his very soul. He didn't dare look back. He couldn't afford to. The gates loomed ahead, a beacon of hope in the darkness. John lunged for them, throwing himself through the opening just as the roar reached a deafening pitch. He slammed the gates shut behind him, the force of the impact rattling the metal. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a heavy thud against the gates, as if something had crashed into them from the other side. The metal groaned under the impact, but held. John stumbled back, panting, his entire body trembling with adrenaline and fear. Whatever had chased him had stopped, the cemetery now silent once more. But the encounter had left a mark, a deep, primal terror that settled into his bones, making him question everything he thought he knew about the world. As he staggered back toward town, the cold night air biting at his skin, John realized the true horror of what he had discovered. The empty coffins, the scratch marks, the creature in the cemetery. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of something much larger, something that defied explanation. And now, John was certain of one thing. Whatever was happening in Oak Ridge, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. In the days following his unsettling encounter at the abandoned cemetery, John becomes consumed by a need to understand the city's dark history. He spends hours in the local library, poring over old newspapers, archives, and any scraps of information he can find about the cemetery and its eerie reputation. His research uncovers a chilling pattern. Over a century ago, the city was gripped by a series of mysterious disappearances. The records paint a harrowing picture of fear and confusion. Entire families vanished without a trace, their homes left in disarray. Local law enforcement, overwhelmed and desperate, could find no leads or clues. As John digs deeper, he discovers reports of strange occurrences and sightings in the cemetery. Witnesses spoke of shadowy figures and disembodied whispers. The city's residents believed that a secretive and sinister cult operated in the shadows, using the cemetery for dark rituals. The cult was rumored to perform rites involving blood sacrifices, seeking to summon malevolent entities or gain otherworldly powers. Despite the widespread panic and several attempts to uncover the truth, the disappearances abruptly ceased. The case files were closed, and the investigation was quietly shelved. The cemetery, once a focal point of dread, was soon forgotten. The city moved on, and the dark chapter was buried under layers of time and neglect. John reads a particularly disturbing account of a local journalist who had been investigating the cult. His notes detail eerie encounters and cryptic warnings from unknown sources. The journalist had mysteriously vanished shortly after submitting his last report. John can't shake the feeling that this case was never truly resolved, and the dark presence that haunted the city a century ago might still be active. As he turns the pages of the old records, John notices a disturbing trend. The disappearances from the past mirror the recent incidents in disturbing detail. The timeline, the patterns, and even the descriptions of the areas where people went missing are alarmingly similar. The sense of déjà vu grows stronger with every revelation. John begins to suspect that the sinister forces responsible for the city's dark history are resurfacing. Feeling a growing sense of dread, John decides to revisit the cemetery with his newfound knowledge. He hopes that understanding the past might provide clues about the present, but he can't shake the fear that he might be walking into a trap set by forces that have been waiting for their chance to strike again. The line between history and the present blurs, and John finds himself on the edge of a terrifying revelation. The relentless pursuit of the city's dark past takes a toll on John. Sleep eludes him as anxiety gnaws at his mind. His once peaceful home becomes a place of torment. At night, he begins to hear faint whispers, almost imperceptible at first. They seem to drift through the house, growing louder and more insistent. The voices are unnerving, whispering his name in hushed tones and murmuring dark secrets that send chills down his spine. The whispers grow more specific, as if they're communicating directly with him. They speak of hidden truths and unspeakable horrors, fragments of sentences that seem to come from different directions, filling the silence with a haunting cacophony. John tries to ignore them, but the persistent, disembodied voices invade his thoughts, and he finds it impossible to escape their eerie presence. As the nights stretch on, John starts to experience vivid and disturbing visions. He sees faces of people he knows to be missing, their expressions frozen in terror. They appear in fleeting glimpses, their eyes wide and pleading, as if trapped in a perpetual state of fear. These apparitions seem to emerge from the shadows, their forms flickering and distorting as if caught between worlds. John feels an overwhelming sense of helplessness as he watches them, their silent screams echoing in his mind. One particularly harrowing night, John awakens in a cold sweat. The room is shrouded in darkness, the oppressive silence broken only by his ragged breaths. His heart pounds in his chest as he senses an ominous presence in the room. He can't shake the feeling that he's not alone. Struggling to calm himself, John turns his gaze towards the foot of his bed. His blood runs cold as he sees a figure standing there, illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through the window. It's Emily Parker, a name he's read about in the old records, a victim from the past whose story has haunted him. Her appearance is grotesque and unsettling. Her eyes are hollow, devoid of life, and her mouth is crudely sewn shut, as if someone has tried to silence her forever. Emily's ghostly form stands motionless, but John can sense an urgent, desperate energy emanating from her. She seems to be trying to communicate something to him, her gaze fixed on him with a look of profound sorrow and fear. John feels a wave of dread wash over him as he tries to decipher the message she's trying to convey. Unable to move or speak, John watches in a paralyzed state as Emily's figure wavers and shifts, her presence growing more intense. The whispers from the night seem to crescendo in a frantic symphony, as if responding to her silent plea. John is overwhelmed by the realization that the spirits are reaching out to him, urging him to uncover the truth behind the horrors that have plagued the city for so long. In the dim light, Emily's ghost begins to slowly fade, leaving John with a sense of urgency and terror. The room grows silent once more, but the weight of her presence lingers, a chilling reminder of the dark forces that have awoken. John knows that the answers he seeks are within reach, but the cost of discovering them may be far greater than he anticipated. Driven by fear and desperation, John decides to seek help from Sheriff Miller, hoping that the law enforcement official might have insights or resources that could aid him in uncovering the truth. He rushes to the sheriff's office, his mind racing with the dark revelations he has encountered. When John arrives, he finds Sheriff Miller in his office, a man visibly worn by stress and years of duty. John wastes no time, recounting the disturbing discoveries he's made: the abandoned cemetery, the historical disappearances, and the ghostly visions. He speaks with a sense of urgency, convinced that the sheriff might hold the key to stopping the horrors. To John's shock, Sheriff Miller listens with an unsettling calmness. Instead of the disbelief John anticipated, Miller's demeanor is one of weary resignation. He reveals that he has been aware of the empty graves and the city's dark past for years. The sheriff's expression darkens as he confides that he has been restrained from taking action due to forces beyond his control. Miller explains that he had encountered the eerie phenomena himself and had conducted his own investigation into the disappearances from a century ago. His findings mirrored John's own, but every time he attempted to act on the information, he was met with bureaucratic hurdles and threats of professional ruin. It becomes evident that Miller has been battling an unseen opposition, one that seems to be protecting or obscuring the truth. As Miller speaks, John notices the pain in his eyes, a reflection of his own growing anxiety. Miller reveals a deeply personal connection to the case. His own daughter had disappeared years ago, and he believes she became another victim of the dark forces that have plagued the city. The sheriff's voice breaks as he recounts his relentless search for her, a search that has led him to the grim realization that something malevolent and inescapable is at work. Before Miller can elaborate further, his strength seems to falter. He clutches his chest, his face contorted in agony. John watches in horror as the sheriff collapses to the floor, struggling for breath. Paramedics arrive swiftly, taking Miller to the hospital. John's attempts to get more information are thwarted by the sudden emergency, leaving him with more questions than answers. Now alone and more unsettled than ever, John is left to confront the chilling reality that the sheriff's collapse might be connected to the very forces they sought to expose. The idea that Miller might have been silenced, or that his own health might be deteriorating due to these dark powers, only heightens John's fear. The sense of isolation becomes palpable as he realizes that he is now on this perilous path without any reliable allies. With the sheriff incapacitated and no clear direction, John begins to grapple with the possibility that he might be facing an insurmountable challenge. His sanity feels increasingly fragile as the weight of the city's dark legacy presses down on him. He is left with a haunting realization. The battle against the malevolent forces is far from over, and he may be fighting it alone. Determined to put an end to the terror plaguing the city, John makes the decision to return to the abandoned cemetery one last time. Armed with a recorder and a camera, he intends to document whatever he encounters in hopes of exposing the malevolent force that has haunted him and the city. As John arrives at the cemetery, he is struck by an even more oppressive atmosphere than before. The air is thick with a foreboding silence, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves and the distant echo of his own footsteps. The cemetery, once merely unsettling, now feels like a place of palpable malice. With a deep breath, John sets to work. He begins to dig near one of the old graves, hoping to uncover more about the dark secrets buried beneath. The ground is hard and unyielding, but John's determination keeps him going. As he digs deeper, the oppressive silence is occasionally pierced by faint, eerie whispers that seem to grow louder with each shovelful of earth he removes. The whispers build into a crescendo of anguished voices, their tone growing more frantic and demanding. John's heart pounds in his chest as he continues to excavate. Finally, he uncovers a coffin that appears distinct from the others. Its craftsmanship is more elaborate, suggesting it might belong to someone of particular significance. With trembling hands, John pries open the coffin. The sight that meets his eyes is both horrifying and tragic. Inside lies Emily Parker, her face frozen in a rictus of terror. The expression of sheer fear on her face speaks volumes, a silent testament to the horrors she must have endured. The sight sends a shiver through John's entire body, reinforcing the reality of the darkness that has been plaguing the city. As he stares in horror at the body, a sudden drop in temperature engulfs the area. John's breath comes out in visible puffs, and a chilling sensation crawls across his skin. The oppressive cold intensifies, and he feels an icy grip on his shoulder. Panic surges through him as he spins around, desperate to confront whatever presence has intruded upon his grim discovery. Standing before him is a cloaked figure, its face obscured by a dark hood. The figure exudes a menacing aura, and its very presence seems to absorb the warmth and light from the surroundings. The hooded figure leans closer, and in a voice that is both chilling and disembodied, it whispers, "You will be next." John's blood runs cold at the ominous declaration. The figure's voice is a blend of malevolence and inevitability, sending a wave of dread crashing over him. The weight of the threat is suffocating, and John realizes the full extent of the danger he is in. The realization dawns on him that the malevolent force that has tormented the city is not only aware of his presence, but is now targeting him directly. With a surge of adrenaline, John grabs his camera and recorder, capturing the hooded figure and the scene around him. Despite his fear, he knows that documenting this encounter could be crucial for anyone who might come after him. The figure begins to move closer, its dark cloak billowing as if in anticipation of John's inevitable fate. John's mind races as he tries to think of a way to escape. He knows he must leave the cemetery, but the terror paralyzes him momentarily. The oppressive cold and the figure's looming presence make every movement feel like wading through a thick, icy fog. In a desperate bid to save himself, John fumbles with his equipment and starts backing away, his eyes never leaving the figure. The shadows around him seem to close in, and the whispers grow louder, filling his ears with the anguished cries of the forgotten. He makes a frantic dash towards the exit of the cemetery, driven by the primal urge to survive. As he stumbles out of the cemetery, John's heart pounds with a mix of terror and relief. He knows that the confrontation has only deepened the mystery and danger. The figure's ominous warning echoes in his mind, and he understands that the battle is far from over. The city's dark secrets are still out there, and John is now a central part of the unfolding horror. The morning after John's harrowing confrontation at the cemetery, the local police make a grim discovery. They find his camera and recorder abandoned at the cemetery, but John is nowhere to be seen. The equipment, though undamaged, provides no clues to his whereabouts. The footage from the camera reveals only fragmented scenes of John's investigation, interspersed with the unsettling whispers that had tormented him. The recordings capture his initial unease, the uncovering of Emily Parker's body, and the ominous encounter with the hooded figure, but they end abruptly, leaving no explanation for his disappearance. The police launch a search operation, scouring the cemetery and the surrounding area for any trace of John. Despite their efforts, no sign of him is found. The lack of evidence only deepens the mystery, and speculation runs rampant throughout the city. The police are left with unanswered questions and an increasing sense of unease. Sheriff Miller, now recovering in the hospital from his collapse, is informed of John's disappearance. Despite his weakened state, he is determined to review the footage from John's camera and recorder. As he watches the recordings, his face pales with dread. The final moments of John's investigation reveal the true horror of what lurks within the cemetery. The sinister whispers and the appearance of the hooded figure resonate with Miller's own experiences, confirming his fears that something far more malevolent has been awakened. Miller is haunted by the realization that the dark forces he had suspected are indeed active and dangerous. The footage's last cryptic message, the hooded figure's chilling warning, serves as a grim confirmation that John's fate is a part of a larger, horrifying pattern. Days pass, and the city remains in a state of eerie stillness. An unsettling new development occurs. Another fresh grave appears in the abandoned cemetery. Like the others before it, this new grave is found empty. Its presence only adds to the growing sense of dread that permeates the city. The fresh grave is a grim reminder of the unresolved terror that continues to haunt the cemetery. The legend of the cemetery of the disappeared takes on a life of its own, becoming a chilling story whispered among residents. The fear and anxiety that once simmered below the surface now dominate the city's collective psyche. People talk in hushed tones about the dark forces that claim victims and the inexplicable disappearances that have plagued their town. The city, now deeply unsettled, waits with bated breath for the next chapter in the nightmare. The cemetery of the disappeared stands as a grim monument to the unknown horrors that lie in wait. The legend grows, and the cycle of fear and disappearance continues, leaving the city in a perpetual state of anticipation and dread.